Welcome to the video that walks through the frequently made mistakes for assignment 3A. First and foremost, please make sure you document your code thoroughly. It's not enough to get the correct implementation. You also have to make sure you document your code to explain what it is you're doing. Let's take a look at some of the mistakes that people made. This is a mistake that's really been left over from a previous assignment. It's very important to make sure that when you gaze into the Palantir, that if an exception is thrown, the Palantir will be released no matter what happens. So make sure you put the appropriate try finally block here in order to handle this case. Likewise, here's another problem left over from a previous assignment that should have been fixed much earlier. Make sure that you structure your code so that if you end up with an exception, you don't need to check to see whether or not the Palantir equals null before you call release Palantir. Here's an example of a bug with the create executor service factory method. Please note that this factory method was intended to create a cached thread pool, not a fixed thread pool. So make sure you update the call appropriately. At this point, you should be well enough versed with Java 8 that you no longer have to use the Java 7 for each loops. So please replace the uses of Java 7 for each loops with a for each method and a method reference. Make sure you're using a method reference as well as using a for each method. This piece of code was missing something very important. I don't see how this submission could ever possibly have passed the test, so make sure that you fix that. And also, once again, make sure you use a method reference rather than a lambda expression here. This implementation of await completion of futures makes no sense. This is intended to wait until all the results are done. So read the documentation carefully. The specification is not intending to create yet another instance of the executor service, which makes no sense. This code is basically essentially mimicking what had been in the previous method where all the wheels were set in motion. There's a number of problems in this implementation of await completion of futures. First and foremost, there's an off by one error, so make sure that you don't have these kinds of problems in your code. Very common problem with C and C++, but you need to be careful not to replicate that type of mistake in your code. And then down here, make sure that you get the result from take, which will be a future, of course, and then that you actually get the result of the future and do something sensible with it, like log it to the controller using the controller's log method. This was a strange implementation of the shutdown now method. For some reason, the person was calling the poll method on the executor completion service, which makes no sense. That's certainly not part of the specification. And likewise, the specification here explicitly says you need to shut down the executor service now. And that does not require calling shutdown beings, which does something different. Here's another example of a buggy implementation of shutdown now. I'm not so sure it's sort of buggy. Most importantly, number one, it's buggy, and number two, it doesn't implement the functionality in the specification correctly. It's way too complicated and does way too many things that are not needed in order to be able to meet the spec. So don't write complicated code like this. The code is actually really, really simple to implement shutdown now. You just have to think about what the semantics of shutdown now mean in the context of a call on the executor service. So that's basically my synopsis of the frequently made mistakes in assignment 3A. Make sure that you fix these before you submit assignment 3B, which will be out shortly.